Beneath the sun-scorched streets of Gaza, a shadow economy thrives in darkness. Miles of tunnels, some narrow as coffins, others wide enough for trucks, form an invisible empire that has moved everything from cigarettes to surface to air missiles. This is the story of how Hamas transformed ancient smuggling routes into a billion-dollar lifeline, bankrolling an organization, feeding a population, and changing the balance of power in one of the world's most contested territories. For 2 decades, these tunnels have been dug by hand, flooded by enemies, rebuilt by moonlight. They've enriched warlords and sustained families. They've smuggled hope and weaponized desperation. This investigation follows the money, the diggers, the enforcers, and the civilians caught between survival and siege. Welcome to the underground empire that the world forgot to watch. The first tunnel wasn't built for weapons. In 1994, as the Oslo Accords promised peace and the newly formed Palestinian Authority took control of Gaza, a cigarette smuggler named Ahmed dug a 40-meter passage under the Rafah border. His investment, $3,000 in 6 weeks of nocturnal labor. His return in the first month, $20,000. The Egyptian side provided cheap tobacco. The Gazan side provided desperate customers willing to pay triple the Cairo street price. Ahmed's tunnel lasted 9 months before Israeli intelligence detected it. By then, 12 others had opened. The economics were irresistible. Gaza, squeezed between Israel, Egypt, and the Mediterranean, had always been a smuggling corridor. But the 1,990 seconds brought new pressures. A population of 1 million, growing to 2 million within a generation, pressed against borders that opened and closed according to security calculations made in Jerusalem and Cairo. The formal economy withered. Unemployment climbed past 40%. The informal economy, black markets, gray imports, cash transactions invisible to any government became the real economy. Hamas watched and learned. When the organization won parliamentary elections in 2006, triggering an international aid boycott and an Israeli-Egyptian blockade, the tunnels transformed from criminal nuisance to strategic infrastructure. What had been dozens became hundreds. What had been cigarettes and electronics became construction materials, fuel, medicine, and increasingly, military hardware. Hamas didn't just tolerate the tunnels, they systematized them. The model was elegant. Hamas imposed a licensing system. You couldn't dig without approval from the internal security apparatus. Each tunnel required registration, documentation, and a substantial fee, often $50,000, just to begin excavation. Once operational, Hamas taxed everything that moved underground. Cigarettes, 25%, fuel, flat rate per liter, construction materials, variable rates that changed with scarcity, weapons, top secret, handled by separate units, but universally understood to be the most profitable category. By 2010, intelligence analysts estimated 1,500 tunnels operated simultaneously. Rafah became a city with 2 surfaces, the visible streets where Egyptian and Palestinian border guards maintained checkpoints, and the invisible network 20 meters below where the real commerce happened. Tunnel construction became Gaza's primary employer. Diggers earned $300 monthly, twice the average wage. Engineers who could shore up unstable sand with proper reinforcements commanded 4 times that. The most skilled tunnel architects, men who could design passages deep enough to avoid Israeli ground-penetrating radar, yet shallow enough to avoid flooding, became wealthy. The billion-dollar figure comes from multiple sources, none perfectly reliable. Israeli military intelligence in 2012 estimated annual tunnel revenue at $700 million. Palestinian economists surveying Rafah merchants suggested higher numbers, potentially $1.2 billion at peak operation. The discrepancy matters less than the scale. Hamas had created an economic engine that employed thousands, enriched hundreds, and most critically freed the organization from dependence on external donors who could be pressured by Western governments. But the tunnels carried costs beyond the financial. Egyptian workers on the Sinai side, often Bedouin tribesmen squeezed out of formal employment, dug with minimal safety equipment. Collapses killed dozens, perhaps hundreds. The death toll remains disputed, because both Hamas and Egyptian authorities had incentives to undercount. Gazan diggers fared slightly better, but not much. In 2009, a single tunnel collapse buried 17 men. Their families received payments, though whether as compensation or hush money depended on who you asked. The Israeli response evolved. Early efforts focused on detection and targeted strikes, bunker-buster bombs dropped on suspected tunnel entrances. Then came flooding, pumping seawater from the Mediterranean into known tunnel networks, collapsing passages and contaminating groundwater. The environmental damage would take decades to calculate. Egypt, facing its own security concerns after the 2013 coup, eventually demolished the Rafah buffer zone, destroying hundreds of homes and establishing a kilometer-deep cleared border that made new tunnel construction nearly impossible. By 2015, the golden age of tunnels was ending, but the infrastructure remained miles of passages, some still operational, others flooded or sealed. And the economic model Hamas perfected underground would influence everything that followed. The organization had learned to build revenue streams independent of international banking, invisible to satellite surveillance, and resilient against conventional military pressure. The question wasn't whether the tunnels would be rebuilt. It was what lessons Hamas had learned about sustainable funding for organizations the world had tried to isolate. Before the weapons, before the surveillance, before the billion-dollar empire, there was tobacco. In the mid-1990 seconds, a pack of Cleopatras cost 3 shekels in Cairo and 12 in Gaza. That 9-shekel margin built the first generation of tunnel millionaires, men who understood that scarcity plus demand equals opportunity, and that 30 meters of dirt could hide fortunes. Mahmoud al-Farah didn't look like a kingpin, short, balding, soft-spoken. He ran a small grocery in Rafah's Tel al-Sultan neighborhood, where Egyptian smugglers had operated since Ottoman times. But in 1995, al-Farah made a calculation that would reshape Gaza's underground economy. Israeli checkpoints made overland smuggling nearly impossible. Maritime routes faced constant naval patrols. But beneath the border, the sandy soil was soft enough to dig by hand, yet stable enough to tunnel through. His first passage took 8 weeks. Al-Farah hired 4 laborers, paying them by the meter advanced. They worked midnight to dawn, disposing of excavated sand by spreading it across construction sites and agricultural fields. The tunnel measured 80 meters longer than necessary, ensuring it crossed well beyond the surface border markers. At the Egyptian end, Al-Farah partnered with a Bedouin supplier who could obtain cartons by the truckload from Cairo wholesalers. The first shipment was 30 cartons, 6,000 cigarettes. Al-Farah sold them in 48 hours. His profit margin exceeded 300% after paying smuggling costs and bribes to the Palestinian Authority police who controlled Rafah at the time. Within 6 months, he was moving 200 cartons weekly. Within a year, 5 competitors had opened their own tunnels, and the underground cigarette trade employed over 100 people in Rafah alone. The logistics were surprisingly sophisticated. Tunnels couldn't be too shallow. Israeli ground-penetrating radar could detect voids at depths less than 12 meters, but they couldn't be too deep either. Below 20 meters, groundwater seepage became unmanageable without expensive pumping system. The optimal depth was 15 meters, shallow enough to dig manually, deep enough to avoid most surveillance technology available in the 1,990 seconds. Transportation inside the tunnels evolved rapidly. Early smugglers crawled through passages barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, dragging bags behind them. Then came plastic sleds pulled by ropes. By 1998, the most profitable tunnels had installed cable pulley systems, allowing operators to move half-ton loads in a single trip. The most sophisticated operations used electric rail systems, miniature tracks with motorized carts that could haul a ton of cargo from one end to the other in under 20 minutes. The cigarette trade established patterns that would govern all future smuggling. Tunnel ownership was usually syndicated. 3 to 5 investors would pool capital for construction, then share profits proportionally. Operators paid diggers and transporters fixed wages, keeping the margin. Security was paramount. Rival groups occasionally sabotaged competitors' tunnels by tipping off authorities or, in extreme cases, collapsing passages through flooding. Violence remained rare in the cigarette era. Profit margins were high enough that cooperation made more sense than conflict. Palestinian Authority officials took their cut through a combination of licensing fees and direct partnership. Senior security officers became silent investors in tunnel operations, providing protection in exchange for shares of revenue. This corruption paradoxically created stability. Tunnels that paid their bribes operated openly. Those that didn't faced raids and closures, though the punishment was usually temporary, a month's forced shutdown, then resumption, under new management or with proper payments arranged. The cigarette boom peaked between 1997 and 2001. Intelligence estimates suggested that 60 to 80 tunnels operated continuously, moving 2,000 cartons daily into Gaza. At street value, the trade represented roughly $50 million annually, more than the entire formal import-export economy of Rafah. The social impact was visible. Tunnel investors built large homes. Smuggler families sent children to universities in Egypt and Jordan. The neighborhood around the border transformed from a neglected periphery into Rafah's most prosperous district. But the cigarette kings were building more than wealth. They were establishing technical expertise, logistical networks, and political relationships that would prove crucial when the commodity changed from tobacco to weapons. The diggers who learned to shore up sand walls would later build chambers to store rockets. The pulley operators who moved cartons would adapt their systems for heavier military cargo. The security officers who took cigarette bribes would eventually facilitate arms transfers. In 2001, the Second Intifada erupted. Israeli military pressure intensified. The Palestinian Authority's control over Gaza weakened. Hamas, still years from taking power, was watching the cigarette kings carefully, understanding that the tunnels represented something more valuable than tobacco revenue. They represented infrastructure for resistance, economic independence from international donors, and proof that Gaza could sustain itself through ingenuity rather than aid. The cigarette era was ending. The weapons era was about to begin. Tunneling through sand sounds simple until you try it. 30 meters down, the pressure makes walls weep moisture. Oxygen thins. Collapse comes without warning, a crack, a groan, then suffocation and darkness. The men who mastered underground engineering didn't have textbooks or blueprints. They had trial, error, and body counts that neither government bothered to track accurately. Ahmed al-Masri learned tunneling the hard way. In 1997, he was 23, unemployed, and desperate enough to accept work digging for a cigarette smuggler. His first shift lasted 6 hours. He descended a narrow shaft on a rope ladder, crawled through a half-finished passage barely high enough to crouch, and spent the night filling buckets with sand that other workers hauled topside. The walls dripped constantly. The air tasted of earth and decay. When he emerged at dawn, coughing and filthy, the foreman paid him 30 shekels and asked if he'd return. He returned for 3 years, not because he loved the work, nobody loved the work, but because tunnel diggers earned wages that factory workers and farmers couldn't imagine. More importantly, he learned. The experienced diggers taught him to read sand composition by texture, moisture, and color. Light tan sand with fine grain was stable. Darker, wet sand could collapse without warning. The presence of clay layers meant you could dig deeper without reinforcement. Pure sand required wooden supports every 2 meters. By 2000, al-Masri had graduated from digger to engineer, one of perhaps 30 men in Rafah with the expertise to design tunnels that wouldn't kill their operators. His knowledge was entirely experiential. He'd never seen technical drawings or studied soil mechanics, but he understood load distribution, ventilation, and the critical importance of slight upward angles to prevent water accumulation. Tunnel owners paid him consultancy fees of $500 per project. Extraordinary money in an economy where monthly wages averaged $200. The engineering challenges were formidable. Depth was the first calculation. Shallow tunnels were faster and cheaper to dig, but vulnerable to detection and collapse. Deep tunnels required more sophisticated ventilation and support structures. Al-Masri typically recommended 15 meters deep enough to avoid Israeli ground-penetrating radar, shallow enough to manage with manual excavation and basic pumping systems. Ventilation was the invisible killer. Carbon dioxide accumulated in sealed underground spaces, creating suffocation zones that killed without warning. Early tunnels used simple air shafts, vertical pipes extending to the surface, concealed in buildings or agricultural plots. More sophisticated operations installed electric fans powered by generators, creating positive pressure that pushed fresh air through the passage. The most advanced tunnels had dual ventilation systems, intake at one end, exhaust at the other, maintaining continuous airflow. Water management separated amateur operations from professional ones. Below 12 meters in Rafah, groundwater seepage was constant. Poorly designed tunnels flooded within weeks, becoming useless. Al-Masri's solution was simple but effective. Slight gradient design that allowed water to flow to collection sumps, combined with manual or electric pumps that evacuated water daily. Some tunnels incorporated drainage pipes, salvaged from construction sites. Installed beneath the main passage floor, structural reinforcement evolved through deadly trial and error. The earliest tunnels used no supports, relying on the natural cohesion of moist sand. Collapse rates were catastrophic. An estimated 30% of early tunnels failed within 6 months. By the late 1992, standard practice involved wooden frames every 2 to 3 meters, vertical posts supporting horizontal beams, creating rectangular openings that distributed ceiling weight. The wood came from demolished buildings, disassembled furniture, anything available in a blockaded territory short on construction materials. The most dangerous moment was breakthrough when diggers on opposite ends of a tunnel met in the middle. Miscalculation meant the passages wouldn't align, wasting weeks of work. Al-Masri developed a technique using plumb lines and compass bearings to maintain direction. Later, more sophisticated operations used laser levels and GPS coordinates, though such technology remained rare until the mid-2000s. Death was an occupational constant. Al-Masri personally knew 17 men who died in collapses, suffocations, or electrocutions from jury-rigged electrical systems. The bodies were usually recovered, though not always. Some families received compensation, typically $5,000 to $10,000, paid quietly by tunnel owners who didn't want attention. Others received nothing, particularly if the deceased had worked for operations that lacked proper licensing or political protection. By 2005, when Hamas began systematically taking control of tunnel infrastructure, Al-Masri had become invaluable. The organization recruited him as a trainer, teaching new generations of diggers the techniques he'd refined through a decade of underground work. His compensation reflected his value: a monthly salary of $1,200, housing, and a position that kept him above ground, supervising rather than digging. He had survived the darkness. Many of his students wouldn't. Political movements need 3 things to survive: ideology, fighters, and money. Hamas had the first 2 in abundance by 2005, but ideology doesn't pay salaries, and fighters need weapons, safe houses, and families to feed. The tunnels represented a solution that international donors couldn't cut off, and that rival Palestinian factions couldn't control. The question wasn't whether Hamas would seize the underground economy, but how ruthlessly they'd do it. The transformation began quietly. In late 2006, months after Hamas won parliamentary elections and triggered the international aid boycott, senior Hamas officials in Gaza, particularly those in the internal security apparatus, understood that political legitimacy meant nothing if the organization couldn't deliver services, pay fighters, and maintain operations while cut off from global banking. The tunnels, previously treated as criminal enterprises requiring occasional taxation, suddenly looked like strategic infrastructure. Ismail Haniyeh, the newly appointed prime minister, publicly condemned smuggling while privately meeting with senior Hamas commanders to discuss tunnel systematization. The conversations, later partially reconstructed through Israeli intelligence intercepts and interviews with former Hamas officials, focused on a straightforward question: could Hamas control tunnel revenue without destroying the system's productivity? The risk was alienating tunnel owners, many of whom had no Hamas affiliation and resented interference. The opportunity was capturing hundreds of millions in annual revenue that currently flowed to independent operators. The strategy that emerged was elegant. Rather than nationalizing tunnels outright, which would have required Hamas to manage construction, operation, and maintenance, the organization imposed a licensing regime. Existing tunnel owners could continue operating, but only after registering with Hamas's newly formed Tunnels Affairs Commission, a bureaucratic creation that masked what was essentially an extortion operation. The registration fee started at $25,000 per tunnel, later rising to $50,000 for premium locations near the border. But licensing was just the entry cost. Hamas then instituted a comprehensive taxation system on everything that moved underground. The tax rates varied by commodity and were adjusted monthly based on scarcity and profitability. Cigarettes, 25% of gross revenue. Construction materials, 15% plus fixed per ton fees. Fuel, flat rate per liter that often exceeded 30% of value. Electronics and luxury goods, 40%. The highest rates, never publicly disclosed, applied to weapons and military equipment. Some estimates suggested Hamas took 75% of weapons smuggling revenue. Enforcement was methodical and occasionally brutal. Hamas deployed internal security officers to tunnel entrances, maintaining constant surveillance on what entered and exited. Tunnel owners who attempted to evade taxes faced escalating consequences. First warnings, then forced closures, ultimately confiscation of tunnel infrastructure. Several prominent smugglers who resisted simply disappeared, arrested on unspecified charges, held in Hamas-run detention facilities, until family members negotiated their release by ceding partial tunnel ownership to Hamas-affiliated operators. The financial impact was immediate. By mid-2007, Hamas was collecting an estimated $40 to $60 million annually from tunnel operations, more than the organization had received from external donors in the previous year. This revenue funded everything from civil service salaries to weapons purchases to social welfare programs that maintained Hamas's popularity among ordinary Gazans who benefited from subsidized goods smuggled through the system. But Hamas didn't just tax the tunnels they invested in them. The organization funded expansion of the most profitable routes, provided technical assistance for ventilation and reinforcement, and most critically, established security arrangements with Egyptian counterparts. Through a combination of direct payments and political pressure channeled through the Muslim Brotherhood's Egyptian networks, Hamas secured cooperation from Egyptian border officials who previously had shut down tunnels unpredictably. The systematization created winners and losers. Established tunnel owners who accepted Hamas's terms often prospered. The organization's security umbrella meant more predictable operations and less harassment from either Palestinian or Egyptian authorities. New entrants found the barrier to entry much higher. The $50,000 licensing fee, combined with construction costs often exceeding $100,000, meant tunnel operations became the province of established families and Hamas-affiliated investors. Critics within Gaza, particularly Fatah supporters who saw Hamas using tunnel revenue to consolidate power, accused the organization of replacing one corrupt system with another. They weren't wrong. Hamas's Tunnels Affairs Commission operated with zero transparency, answering only to the organization's senior political leadership. But Hamas offered something the previous system hadn't: stability. Tunnels that paid their fees operated without interference. Smugglers who followed regulations weren't subject to arbitrary raids or shakedowns by competing security factions. By 2008, the transformation was complete. The tunnels had evolved from loosely organized criminal enterprises into a sophisticated parallel economy that Hamas controlled through a combination of taxation, regulation, and strategic violence. The revenue stream allowed Hamas to govern Gaza despite the international blockade, paying tens of thousands of civil servants and maintaining social services while simultaneously funding military operations. The cigarette kings had built an infrastructure. Hamas had weaponized it. Moving a ton of cargo through a tunnel 60 meters long and 1 meter wide requires more than muscle. It requires coordination between Egyptian suppliers, Palestinian receivers, diggers, pullers, surface transporters, and security at each checkpoint. By 2008, the most sophisticated tunnel operations functioned like underground shipping companies, complete with schedules, tracking systems, and customer service. The most efficient tunnel network in Rafah belonged to the Abu Shamala family, established smugglers who had operated in the border area since the 1972nd. By 2008, the family controlled 6 tunnels simultaneously, an empire built on logistics rather than luck. Their operation revealed how professional smuggling had become under Hamas's systematized control. The process began on the Egyptian side. in warehouses scattered across Sinai towns like Sheikh Zuweid and Al Arish. Egyptian suppliers, mostly Bedouin families with their own border connections, accumulated goods based on orders transmitted from Gaza. The ordering system evolved from face-to-face negotiations to mobile phone coordination to eventually encrypted messaging apps that allowed detailed manifests to be shared securely. A typical order might include 50 tons of cement, 200 gallons of fuel, 30 cartons of cigarettes, and specific electronics requested by Gaza merchants. Transportation to tunnel entrances was the Egyptian side's responsibility. Suppliers used everything from pickup trucks to donkey carts, depending on proximity to Egyptian security forces and the need for discretion. The goods were staged in surface buildings, often ordinary homes, or shops directly above tunnel entrances. Egyptian operators dropped cargo through vertical shafts, sometimes using manual hoists, more often simply lowering goods on ropes. The underground journey was where the Abu Shamale family's expertise showed. Their tunnels featured electric rail systems, salvaged mining cart tracks mounted on wooden supports, powered by generators on both ends. Operators on the Egyptian side loaded carts with up to 300 kilograms of cargo, then activated the pulley system that drew the carts to the Gaza side. Transit time for a 60-meter tunnel, 6 to 8 minutes. Daily capacity per tunnel, 15 to 20 tons, depending on commodity type and packaging. Receiving operations on the Gaza side were equally sophisticated. The Abu Shamala family employed 12 full-time workers per active tunnel, 4 on underground duty, loading and unloading carts, 4 on surface transport, moving goods from tunnel exits to temporary storage warehouses, 4 on security and coordination, managing schedules and liaising with Hamas officials who monitored operations. Quality control was critical. Tunnel conditions, moisture, pressure, rough handling damaged goods regularly. The Abu Shamale operation inspected everything that emerged from tunnels, categorizing items as pristine, slightly damaged, or unsellable. Pristine goods went to premium customers at full markup. Damaged items sold at discount. Unsellable merchandise was often donated to Hamas social services, generating goodwill and tax advantages. Scheduling was complex. Each tunnel had optimal operating hours, typically midnight to dawn, when surface surveillance was minimal. But peak tunnels like the Abu Shamala network ran continuous operations, accepting the increased risk in exchange for higher volume. The family maintained detailed logs: what entered each tunnel, when, what emerged, time elapsed, any incidents or delays. These records served multiple purposes: internal efficiency analysis, evidence for Hamas tax collectors, and proof for customers disputing delivery times. The human cost of this efficiency was rarely mentioned. The Abu Shamale family lost 2 workers to tunnel collapses between 2007 and 2010, both diggers whose bodies were recovered and whose families received compensation. The family also dealt with chronic health issues among tunnel workers: respiratory problems from poor air quality, back injuries from lifting and pulling, psychological stress from working in confined underground spaces. The family paid slightly above market wages to maintain their workforce, but retention was difficult. Most diggers worked for 2 to 3 years before physical or mental exhaustion forced them to quit. Hamas's taxation added a final layer of complexity. The Tunnels Affairs Commission required manifests for every shipment, cross-checked against receipts from Egyptian suppliers. Discrepancies triggered audits. The Abu Shamale family, with their meticulous record-keeping, rarely faced problems. But smaller operators frequently clashed with Hamas officials over disputed tax assessments, sometimes leading to forced shutdowns or confiscation of goods. By 2009, the Abu Shamale network moved an estimated 300 tons of cargo monthly, generating gross revenue of approximately $1 million. After paying Egyptian suppliers, worker salaries, maintenance costs, and Hamas taxes, net profit was roughly $200,000 monthly. The family had become wealthy by Gaza standards, owning multiple properties, sending children to foreign universities, and wielding influence in local politics. But they were also utterly dependent on the system Hamas controlled. One administrative decision could shut them down. The underground economy had structure now, and structure meant vulnerability. Cigarettes built the tunnels. Construction materials sustained them, but weapons transformed them from economic infrastructure into strategic assets that changed the military balance in Gaza. The shift happened gradually. Then suddenly, as Hamas realized that the same passages moving cement could move rockets, and that dependence on external arms suppliers could be replaced by underground self-sufficiency. The first serious weapons shipments came through tunnels in late 2007, following Hamas's violent takeover of Gaza and the subsequent tightening of the Israeli-Egyptian blockade. Before tunnels became viable for arms smuggling, Hamas depended on a fragile supply chain. Weapons purchased in Sudan or Libya, transported to Sinai by Bedouin smugglers, then moved across the border through bribes and occasional firefights. The system was expensive, unreliable, and vulnerable to interdiction. Tunnels offered something revolutionary: a predictable, high-volume pipeline that Israeli intelligence could detect but couldn't fully stop. The technical requirements for weapons smuggling were more demanding than for cigarettes or food. Anti-tank missiles, rocket components, and ammunition were heavy, temperature-sensitive, and required careful handling. Hamas invested in specialized tunnel infrastructure designed specifically for military cargo. The weapons tunnels were deeper, typically 18 to 20 meters, below the effective depth of most ground-penetrating radar available to Israeli forces at the time. They were wider, allowing larger cargo to pass through. Most critically, they featured reinforced sections that could withstand targeted airstrikes. Israeli intelligence might know a tunnel's approximate location, but destroying it required multiple precision strikes, and Hamas often rebuilt within weeks. The suppliers changed too. While cigarette smuggling relied on ordinary Egyptian merchants, weapons smuggling required connections to shadier networks. Bedouin tribes in Sinai, particularly those involved in the peninsula's black market arms trade, became primary suppliers. Some weapons originated from Libyan stockpiles loosened during Gaddafi's declining years. Others came from Sudan, where Hamas maintained close relationships with the Bashir government. Iranian weapons typically shipped to Sudan, then overland through Egypt, represented the most sophisticated items: Fajr 5 rockets with 45-kilometer range, advanced anti-tank missiles, and components for manufacturing explosives. The logistics of moving a rocket through a tunnel illustrated the operation's complexity. A Grad rocket, Hamas's primary weapon at the time, measured about 2 meters long and weighed 70 kilograms. It wouldn't fit through standard tunnel dimensions without disassembly. Hamas engineers developed protocols: separate the warhead, propulsion unit, and stabilizer fins, package each component in waterproof wrapping, transport through tunnels individually, then reassemble in Gaza workshops. Israeli intelligence tracked this evolution with growing alarm. Assessments from 2008 suggested Hamas was smuggling roughly 90 tons of military material monthly, enough to sustain medium-intensity operations indefinitely. The weapons arsenal in Gaza, which Israeli forces had significantly degraded during their 2002 to 2004 operations, was being rebuilt through tunnels faster than airstrikes could diminish it. Hamas organized weapons smuggling through specialized units separate from commercial tunnel operations. The Internal Security Forces Smuggling Prevention Department, despite its name, actually coordinated weapons imports, ensuring military cargo received priority over commercial goods. These units maintained their own tunnels, built to higher specifications, and guarded more carefully than civilian operations. The financial arrangements were murky. Hamas didn't pay market rates for weapons. Doing so would have bankrupted the organization. Instead, they used a combination of political IOUs with Iran and Sudan, direct purchases funded by tunnel revenue, and sophisticated bartering arrangements. Some weapons shipments were apparently fronted by regional supporters, with payment deferred indefinitely or simply forgiven as ideological support for resistance. Egyptian complicity was necessary. Some border officials were bribed. Intelligence estimates suggested Hamas paid millions annually to Egyptian security personnel who allowed weapons shipments to pass checkpoints unchallenged. Other officials were ideologically sympathetic, particularly Muslim Brotherhood members within Egypt's security services, who saw Hamas as fellow travelers deserving assistance. Following the 2011 Egyptian Revolution and Muslim Brotherhood's rise to power, this cooperation temporarily intensified before being crushed after the 2013 military coup. By 2010, Israeli intelligence estimated that Hamas had reconstituted a weapons arsenal larger than what existed before the 2008 to 2009 Gaza war. Rocket stockpiles exceeded 5,000, not sophisticated by regional standards, but sufficient to bombard Israeli cities and maintain Hamas's deterrent capability. The tunnels had achieved something remarkable. They made Hamas militarily sustainable despite facing one of the world's most technologically advanced military forces. But the weapons pipeline created new vulnerabilities. Israeli intelligence focused enormous resources on detecting military tunnels, developing specialized aircraft and drones equipped with advanced sensors. Egyptian security forces, particularly after 2013, began flooding operations that deliberately targeted weapons tunnels while often sparing commercial passages. The underground arms race was escalating, and Hamas would soon learn that what worked against checkpoints didn't always work against seawater and explosives. Israeli military doctrine had always emphasized the visible threats: rockets, mortars, armed fighters. But by 2008, intelligence analysts confronted a different problem: an enemy logistics network they could map but not eliminate, operating in a dimension where air superiority meant nothing. The tunnels required new thinking, new technology, and acceptance that perfect security was impossible as long as people were willing to dig. The first Israeli responses to tunnel proliferation were reactive and largely ineffective. Ground-penetrating radar systems mounted on aircraft could detect large underground voids, but distinguishing between tunnels, sewers, and natural cavities proved difficult. Dozens of airstrikes hit what intelligence assessed as tunnel entrances, but post-strike reconnaissance often revealed that operations resumed within days, sometimes hours. Hamas had learned to build redundancy, multiple tunnels serving similar routes, backup passages, and rapid reconstruction capabilities that frustrated Israeli targeting. In 2009, following the 3-week Gaza war, Israeli military intelligence undertook a comprehensive assessment of the tunnel threat. The classified report, portions of which later leaked to Israeli media, concluded that conventional military responses were insufficient. Airstrikes could damage tunnels, but not eliminate them. Ground operations in Rafah could destroy sections of the network, but required controlling the entire border area, something politically and militarily unsustainable. The report recommended a multi-layered strategy: technological detection, targeted operations, and diplomatic pressure on Egypt to increase enforcement on the Sinai side. The technological investment was substantial. Israel developed specialized ground-penetrating radar systems capable of detecting voids at depths up to 20 meters. These were mounted on slow-flying drones that systematically scanned the Gaza border area, creating three-dimensional maps of suspected tunnel locations. The data was then cross-referenced, with signals intelligence monitoring mobile phone conversations, tracking unusual electricity consumption patterns near the border, and analyzing satellite imagery for suspicious structures or activities. Detection was only the first problem. Destruction required precision. Israel developed specialized bunker-buster bombs designed to penetrate sand and concrete before detonating. These weapons could collapse tunnel sections, but often failed to cause permanent damage. Hamas repair crews frequently had tunnels operational again within weeks. Israeli engineers then proposed more creative solutions: flooding tunnels with seawater pumped from the Mediterranean, introducing sewage to make passages unusable, even explosive charges that would cause controlled collapses of large tunnel sections. The seawater flooding program, initiated in 2013, represented Israel's most ambitious countermeasure. Military engineers installed high-capacity pumps along the border, capable of pushing thousands of cubic meters of seawater into detected tunnel networks. The environmental implications were significant: saltwater infiltration into Gaza's already stressed aquifer, soil contamination, and long-term agricultural damage. International human rights organizations criticized the program, but Israeli officials argued that the security threat justified the environmental cost. Effectiveness was difficult to measure. Israeli military sources claimed the flooding operations destroyed dozens of major tunnels, rendering them permanently unusable. Hamas sources acknowledged damage, but insisted that only a fraction of the tunnel network was affected, and that new tunnels were being constructed faster than old ones were destroyed. The truth likely fell somewhere between. Flooding certainly disrupted operations, but Hamas's adaptive capacity meant the overall impact was temporary rather than strategic. Ground operations provided more definitive results, but at higher cost. During the 2014 Gaza conflict, Israeli forces conducted systematic tunnel clearance operations in areas near the border. Combat engineers used specialized equipment, explosives, concrete cutting tools, and demolition robots to destroy tunnel infrastructure. The Israeli military claimed to have neutralized 32 tunnels during that conflict, significantly degrading Hamas's cross-border attack capability. But the human cost of tunnel countermeasures fell disproportionately on civilians. Israeli strikes targeting tunnels in densely populated areas killed families living above underground passages they often knew nothing about. The destruction of the Rafah buffer zone, hundreds of homes demolished to create a cleared border area, displaced thousands of Palestinian families. Israeli officials argued military necessity. Human rights groups documented displacement that met the legal definition of collective punishment. The diplomatic component focused on Egypt. Israeli intelligence maintained close coordination with Egyptian counterparts, sharing tunnel locations and requesting increased enforcement on the Sinai side. This cooperation intensified dramatically after the 2013 Egyptian military coup, when the new government viewed Hamas as a Muslim Brotherhood affiliate threatening Egyptian security. Egypt's subsequent campaign against tunnels, demolishing the Rafah buffer zone, flooding operations, and destroying access infrastructure proved more effective than Israeli military action. By 2015, Israeli assessments concluded that the peak era of tunnel operations had passed. The combination of military strikes, flooding operations, and Egyptian enforcement had reduced tunnel activity to perhaps 30% of its 2012 peak. But intelligence analysts also acknowledged a critical reality. As long as Gaza remained under blockade and Hamas controlled the territory, the incentive to build tunnels would persist. The underground war wasn't won. It had simply entered a new phase. The engineers designed them. The smugglers profited from them. Hamas controlled them. But the men who actually built the tunnels were something else. Wage laborers trading their health, and sometimes their lives, for salaries that might feed families or might end with suffocation in darkness. They were Gaza's invisible workforce, rarely mentioned in intelligence reports or news coverage, essential and expendable in equal measure. Khalil was 19 when he started digging. The year was 2008. The economy had collapsed following Hamas's takeover and the international blockade, and his family mother, 3 sisters, younger brother depended on income he couldn't provide through legitimate work. Unemployment among young men exceeded 60%. The tunnels paid $300 monthly, sometimes $400 if you worked double shifts. Khalil took the job. The work began with descending 40 feet straight down on a rope ladder that swayed against earthen walls still damp from excavation. The shaft opened into a horizontal passage barely 4 feet high, forcing workers to crouch or crawl. The first sensation was always the air, thick, stale, carrying the scent of earth and human sweat. Ventilation pipes provided minimal airflow, enough to prevent suffocation, but never enough to feel comfortable. A typical shift lasted 6 hours, though some crews worked 8 or even 10 during peak construction periods. The work was brutally simple. Dig, fill buckets, pass buckets back to the shaft where other workers hauled them to the surface. The tools were basic shovels, picks, sometimes pneumatic equipment for breaking through harder clay layers. Progress was measured in meters. A good crew might advance 3 meters per night. A great crew, working optimal soil, could manage 5. The physical toll accumulated quickly. Backs bent permanently from hours of crouched digging. Shoulders wore out from lifting and passing endless buckets of sand. Lungs developed chronic conditions from breathing underground air thick with dust particles. Khalil developed a persistent cough within 3 months, the same cough every tunnel worker eventually acquired. Some men's coughs went away after they quit. Others coughed for the rest of their lives. But the physical exhaustion was manageable compared to the psychological pressure. Every sound, creaking support beams, dripping water, the groan of shifting earth, carried the possibility of collapse. Tunnel workers developed superstitions. Never work alone. Always have an escape route planned. never mocked the previous shift's safety concerns. These weren't irrational fears. Collapses were common. Most crews experienced at least one near miss, where a section of ceiling gave way, burying tools or injuring workers. Fatal collapses were less frequent, but regular enough that every digger knew someone who had died underground. Khalil witnessed his first collapse on his 4th month. The crew was finishing a night shift when the ceiling in a newly excavated section gave way. 3 men were buried. Khalil and other workers dug frantically with their hands, trying to reach the trapped men before suffocation. They recovered 2 alive, badly injured, but breathing. The third, a 25-year-old father of 2, was dead when they reached him, his body crushed by fallen sand and shattered support beams. The funeral was modest. The tunnel owner, as was customary, provided $10,000 to the widow. Hamas officials attended, offering condolences and invoking martyrdom rhetoric that felt hollow to workers who knew the man had died for smuggling cigarettes, not for resistance. Khalil returned to work the next night because refusing would mean losing the job, and losing the job meant his family wouldn't eat. The social dynamics among tunnel workers created their own economy. Experienced diggers commanded higher wages and less dangerous positions supervising, rather than doing the hardest physical labor. New workers, like Khalil had been, took the worst jobs, the deepest sections, the unstable areas, the shifts nobody wanted. Crews developed tight bonds, looking out for each other because tunnel owners and supervisors often prioritized speed over safety. Pay was usually reliable, though subject to the same irregularities that governed all informal employment in Gaza. Sometimes wages arrived late. Sometimes they were shorted, with elaborate excuses about Hamas taxes or equipment costs. Workers rarely had recourse. Complaining meant being replaced by one of the hundreds of unemployed young men desperate for any income. The power imbalance was absolute. By 2011, Khalil had been digging for 3 years. His back was permanently damaged, his lungs compromised, his hands scarred from countless minor injuries. He had saved almost nothing. What he earned went immediately to family expenses. He had no prospects for other employment. He would likely dig until his body gave out, or until the tunnels closed permanently, whichever came first. This was the human foundation of the billion-dollar empire. Young men trading their futures for present survival, invisible to the world above. The tunnels had 2 sides, but only one received attention. While the world focused on Gaza, the Egyptian end of the network operated in relative obscurity. Bedouin families running their own parallel economy, Egyptian security officials taking bribes that sometimes exceeded their annual salaries, and a Sinai Peninsula where central government authority dissolved into a patchwork of tribal power and armed smuggling networks. The Abu Rayyan family had smuggled in Sinai for 3 generations, long before Hamas existed, and decades before tunnels became systematic. Based in Sheikh Zuyed, 30 kilometers from the Gaza border, the family controlled warehouse networks, transportation routes, and most critically relationships with Egyptian officials whose cooperation determined whether shipments reached tunnel entrances or were confiscated in police raids. Mohammed Abu Rayyan, the family's operations chief in 2010, ran a business that would have been impressive in any context. His warehouses stocked everything from construction materials to Egyptian-manufactured foods to electronics shipped from Port Said. When orders arrived from Gaza, usually via encrypted phone communications with Palestinian tunnel operators, Abu Rayyan's workers assembled shipments, arranged transportation, and coordinated delivery to specific tunnel locations. The Egyptian side logistics were more complex than the Gazan side, because the legal environment was murkier. Gaza operated under a form of blockade siege, where smuggling was universally acknowledged, even if officially illegal. Egypt, by contrast, maintained the fiction of border control. Smuggling was officially criminal, subject to prosecution and imprisonment. This created a parallel system where everything was simultaneously illegal and normal, requiring constant negotiation with security forces. Bribes were systematic and predictable. Police checkpoints between Sheikh Zuyed and Rafah charged per-vehicle fees, typically 500 Egyptian pounds for a truck carrying tunnel-bound cargo, more if the cargo was obviously military or particularly valuable. The checkpoint commanders rotated regularly, but the bribery system was institutional rather than individual. New officers received briefings from their predecessors on standard rates and which shipments required higher-level approval. Higher-level approval meant Egyptian military intelligence and internal security officers who controlled access to the border zone itself. These officials received more substantial payments, monthly retainers, rather than per-shipment fees. The Abu Rayyan family paid an estimated $10,000 monthly to maintain good relationships with key officials, ensuring their trucks could reach tunnel entrances without harassment. The relationship between Egyptian security forces and smugglers was complicated by genuine security concerns. Sinai had its own insurgency problems: Bedouin tribal militants who resented government marginalization, jihadist groups inspired by Al-Qaeda, and criminal networks whose violence occasionally spilled into attacks on police stations and checkpoints. Egyptian officials had to balance the profitable smuggling economy against real threats to stability. This balance shifted dramatically after the 2011 Egyptian Revolution. The fall of Mubarak temporarily weakened security force control over Sinai. Smuggling activity surged. Intelligence estimates suggested tunnel traffic doubled between 2011 and 2012. The Muslim Brotherhood's rise to power brought ideological sympathy for Hamas, and some Egyptian officials actively facilitated weapons shipments that previously would have been interdicted. The 2013 military coup reversed everything. The new Egyptian government viewed Hamas as an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, a terrorist organization threatening Egyptian national security. President Sisi ordered a comprehensive crackdown on tunnels. The approach was brutal and effective. Demolish the Rafah buffer zone, destroying hundreds of homes on the Egyptian side to create a cleared border area. Flood detected tunnels with seawater. Arrest smugglers and tunnel operators, and rotate security personnel to prevent the corruption relationships that had sustained smuggling. For families like the Abu Rayyans, the crackdown was catastrophic. Their warehouses were raided, inventory confiscated, and several family members arrested on smuggling charges. The reliable officials who had taken bribes for years were either transferred out of Sinai or became suddenly uncooperative, unwilling to risk careers for payments that no longer seemed worth the risk. Some Egyptian smugglers adapted by going deeper underground, literally and figuratively. They built more sophisticated concealment systems, tunneled from locations farther from the border, and increased bribery payments to officials willing to take higher risks. But the economics had changed fundamentally. Where smuggling once operated with tacit official approval, it now required active evasion of security forces genuinely trying to stop it. The human cost on the Egyptian side was less documented than the Gazan side, but arguably more severe. Egyptian security forces killed dozens of smugglers in border operations between 2013 and 2015, many of them shot while attempting to cross into Gaza or flee tunnel raids. The demolished buffer zone displaced thousands of Egyptian families, most of them Bedouin who had lived in Rafah for generations. They received minimal compensation and were relocated to areas far from the border where their traditional livelihoods were impossible. By 2015, the Egyptian side of the tunnel network was a shadow of its former self, perhaps 10% of peak capacity operational, and that only through increasingly dangerous methods that made survival, much less profit, uncertain. Economics textbooks describe markets as reaching equilibrium, where supply meets demand at a rational price. Gaza's tunnel economy obeyed different rules. Scarcity wasn't an inconvenience, but a permanent condition. And prices reflected not just cost, but layers of political taxation, security risk, and the simple fact that sometimes goods couldn't enter at any price. The tunnels created a strange prosperity built entirely on circumventing siege. By 2012, virtually everything in Gaza had a tunnel price and a non-tunnel price, if non-tunnel options existed at all. Cooking gas, 8 shekels per kilogram through official Israeli approved imports when available, 14 shekels for Egyptian gas smuggled through tunnels. Construction cement, imported cement cost 120 shekels per 50 kilogram bag, tunnel cement 60 shekels. The price differential wasn't just profit margin, it reflected the entire underground economy's cost structure: Egyptian supplier markup, transportation, Hamas taxation, risk premium, and tunnel operator margin. The market distortions created by the blockade and tunnel system produced bizarre results. Some goods were cheaper in besieged Gaza than in Egypt or Israel, because tunnel operations specialized in bulk commodity smuggling that achieved economies of scale impossible through official channels. Egyptian fuel, for instance, was so heavily subsidized by the Egyptian government that even after smuggling costs and Hamas taxes, it undersold Israeli fuel by 40%. This price advantage was intentional on Hamas's part. The organization understood that maintaining public support required delivering economic benefits that offset the costs of international isolation. Tunnel-smuggled fuel powered Gaza's generators during electricity shortages. Tunnel-smuggled construction materials allowed families to rebuild homes damaged in conflicts. Tunnel-smuggled foods provided variety and lower prices than the restricted list of Israeli-approved imports. But the tunnel economy also created dependencies that Hamas exploited. Fuel smuggling generated massive revenue. Estimates suggested Hamas collected $40 million annually from fuel taxes alone. The organization used this revenue to subsidize electricity and provide direct cash payments to civil servants whose salaries international donors no longer funded. Ordinary Gazans benefited from cheaper goods while simultaneously funding an organization that perpetuated the conflict driving the blockade. The merchant class that emerged from the tunnel economy represented a new form of wealth in Gaza. Pre-2007, Gaza's economic elite were typically professionals, government officials, or families with established businesses. Post-2007, the wealthiest Gazans were often men who had built fortunes on tunnel operations either as owners or as merchants who bought tunnel-smuggled goods wholesale and distributed them retail. These tunnel millionaires displayed their wealth carefully. Ostentatious spending attracted unwanted attention from Hamas's internal security, which monitored displays of wealth for evidence of tax evasion or unauthorized profiteering. But subtle markers appeared: newer cars, larger homes, children attending expensive private schools, and most telling, the ability to maintain lifestyle standards even during economic downturns that devastated ordinary families. The consumer experience of the tunnel economy was surprisingly normal. Gazan shoppers in markets and stores saw products on shelves: Egyptian cookies, Turkish televisions, Chinese toys, without necessarily knowing or caring that most had come through tunnels. Merchants competed on price and quality, not on smuggling credentials. The underground infrastructure had become so normalized that it was invisible to daily commerce. Price volatility, however, was constant. Israeli military operations targeting tunnels could reduce supply overnight, causing prices to spike. Egyptian crackdowns produced similar effects. In late 2012, following an Israeli military operation that destroyed numerous tunnels, fuel prices in Gaza tripled within a week. Hamas responded by rationing fuel allocation, prioritizing hospitals and essential services, but ordinary families faced impossible choices between transportation, cooking, and heating. The environmental costs of the tunnel economy were less visible, but equally significant. Substandard Egyptian fuel dumped contaminants into Gaza's air. Diesel generators running on smuggled fuel produced pollution that contributed to respiratory diseases. The tunnel network itself had punctured Gaza's aquifer in numerous locations, allowing saltwater intrusion that was destroying the territory's already limited freshwater resources. Despite these costs, the tunnel economy had achieved something remarkable. It had sustained 2 million people under siege conditions that should have caused economic collapse. International agencies predicted humanitarian catastrophe when the blockade tightened in 2007. The catastrophe was partially averted not through international assistance, but through an elaborate smuggling infrastructure that moved an estimated 70% of Gaza's total imports by 2012. This success created its own trap. Every ton of goods smuggled through tunnels reduced international pressure on Israel to ease the blockade. Every shekel of Hamas taxation funded an organization whose military activities provided justification for maintaining restrictions. The tunnel economy had become simultaneously the solution to Gaza's economic isolation and the reason that isolation persisted. It was a prosperity built on permanent siege, sustainable only as long as people were willing to dig, and fragile enough that any significant disruption could shatter it overnight. 50 days of war in summer 2014 destroyed more tunnels than all previous Israeli operations combined. But the real turning point wasn't the military campaign, it was what came after. When Egypt completed what Israel had started by systematically eliminating the infrastructure that had sustained Gaza's underground economy, the billion-dollar empire didn't collapse overnight. It bled out slowly, one flooded passage at a time. The 2014 Gaza conflict, Israel called it Operation Protective Edge. Hamas called it the Battle of the Eaten Liver, began on July 8, with Israeli airstrikes responding to rocket fire. By July 17, Israeli ground forces had entered Gaza with a specific mission, unlike previous operations: systematic destruction of Hamas's tunnel infrastructure. Military planners had concluded that airstrikes alone couldn't eliminate the threat. Ground forces would have to locate, clear, and demolish tunnels one by one. The Israeli operation concentrated on the border area, particularly Rafah and Khan Yunis, where tunnel density was highest. Combat engineer battalions advanced methodically, using specialized detection equipment to locate underground passages. When tunnels were found, demolition teams sealed entrances with explosives, pumped them full of concrete, or planted charges deep inside that caused catastrophic collapses. Hamas fought to protect the tunnel infrastructure, understanding that its loss would cripple both military capabilities and economic sustainability. Firefights erupted around tunnel entrances. Hamas fighters used the tunnels themselves, tactically emerging behind Israeli positions, launching ambushes, then retreating underground before airstrikes could respond. The Israeli military lost significant casualties in these engagements, particularly when infantry units encountered tunnels they hadn't detected and were attacked from below. By the time the ceasefire took effect on August 26, Israeli forces claimed to have destroyed 32 cross-border attack tunnels passages designed for Hamas fighters to infiltrate Israel, and damaged or demolished dozens of smuggling tunnels along the Egyptian border. Independent verification was impossible, but the scope of Israeli ground operations suggested the destruction was substantial. Satellite imagery showed enormous areas of Rafah reduced to rubble, particularly areas near the border where tunnels were concentrated. But the more consequential blow came from Egypt. The Sisi government, watching the 2014 conflict, concluded that Gaza's tunnel infrastructure represented an unacceptable security threat to Egyptian interests. In October 2014, Egypt announced plans to create an expanded buffer zone along the Gaza border, a kilometer-deep cleared area that would make tunnel construction from Egyptian territory virtually impossible. The implementation was brutal. Egyptian security forces gave residents in the affected area minimal notice, sometimes as little as 48 hours before demolitions began. Bulldozers destroyed approximately 800 homes on the Egyptian side of Rafah, displacing thousands of families who had lived there for generations. The displaced received minimal compensation, offers of a few thousand Egyptian pounds for homes worth many times that amount. Simultaneously, Egypt intensified tunnel destruction operations. Military engineers identified hundreds of tunnels using detection equipment similar to Israeli systems. The response was methodical. Flood tunnels with seawater pumped from the Mediterranean, collapse them with explosives, then cover the area with concrete barriers that made rebuilding prohibitively difficult. The economic impact on Gaza was immediate and severe. Fuel prices, which had stabilized around 12 shekels per liter during peak tunnel operations, spiked to 25 shekels within months as smuggling capacity collapsed. Construction material prices doubled, then tripled. Merchants who had built businesses on tunnel-smuggled goods found supply chains severed overnight. Some adapted by finding alternative suppliers through Israel's official import system, but at much higher costs. Others simply went bankrupt. Hamas's revenue from tunnel taxation, which had peaked at approximately $70 million annually, declined precipitously. By early 2015, estimates suggested Hamas was collecting less than $20 million annually from remaining tunnel operations. This fiscal crisis forced difficult choices: cut civil service salaries, reduce social service spending, or somehow find alternative revenue sources that didn't depend on tunnels. The humanitarian consequences were significant but complex. On one hand, the tunnel economy's collapse meant reduced access to affordable goods, worsening an already severe economic crisis. On the other hand, the pre-2014 situation where Gaza's survival depended on an illegal smuggling infrastructure was unsustainable by any conventional measure. International aid organizations found themselves dealing with a territory that had lost its unofficial economic lifeline while still facing the same blockade restrictions that had necessitated tunnels in the first place. By mid-2015, Israeli intelligence assessed that operational tunnel capacity had decreased by approximately 75% from its 2012 peak. The remaining tunnels were smaller, less sophisticated, and operated with far greater risk. The billion-dollar empire hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had fundamentally transformed from a systematic parallel economy into a marginal, dangerous activity that couldn't sustain either Hamas's revenue needs or Gaza's economy. The underground empire was dying. The question was what would replace it. The tunnels smuggled milk and missiles, medicine and mortars. They fed families and funded warfare. International law and humanitarian principles offered no clear guidance on infrastructure that simultaneously sustained civilian life and enabled armed conflict. The moral complexity wasn't theoretical. It was lived daily by 2 million Gazans, whose survival increasingly depended on a system the world condemned. In 2013, before the tunnel collapse, a pediatrician at Gaza's Shifa hospital received a shipment of insulin that had arrived through tunnels. The medication was Egyptian manufactured, properly refrigerated during transport, and sold at prices 40% below Israeli imported alternatives. The doctor knew the tunnels also moved weapons. She used the insulin anyway, because diabetic children don't care about geopolitical complexity. This was the humanitarian paradox in its starkest form. Infrastructure designed for resistance had become essential for survival. By 2012, estimates suggested that 70% of consumer goods in Gaza arrived through tunnels. This included foods, medicines, construction materials, and fuel. Hospitals depended on tunnel-smuggled diesel to power generators during electricity shortages. Families cooked on tunnel-smuggled gas. Children attended schools built with tunnel-smuggled cement. International humanitarian organizations faced impossible choices. Their mandate was to assist civilians in crisis. But the tunnels that kept Gaza's economy functioning violated international law and undermined the Israeli-Egyptian blockade. Some organizations maintained strict separation, providing only goods that came through official channels. Others pragmatically acknowledged that tunnel-smuggled supplies were keeping people alive and focused on ensuring quality and safety rather than source. The Israeli position was unambiguous. The tunnels were military infrastructure, and anything that sustained them indirectly supported Hamas's military capabilities. This logic extended to civilian goods. If the tunnels could move construction materials for civilian homes, they could move materials for military bunkers. If they could transport food, they could transport weapons. There was no meaningful way to maintain humanitarian tunnels. Separate from military ones, the infrastructure was identical, and Hamas controlled both. This argument had merits but also problems. International humanitarian law distinguishes between military and civilian objects, requiring belligerents to minimize civilian harm even when targeting legitimate military objectives. The tunnel network was genuinely dual-use infrastructure, simultaneously military and civilian in function. Destroying all tunnels would eliminate Hamas's weapons smuggling capability, but it would also devastate Gaza's civilian economy and potentially cause humanitarian catastrophe. Palestinian perspectives emphasize the blockade itself as the root problem. If Israel and Egypt allowed normal commercial activity, tunnels would be unnecessary. The fact that an illegal smuggling infrastructure had become essential for civilian survival demonstrated the blockade's severity. From this view, the tunnels were a consequence of collective punishment against Gaza's civilian population, and calling them military infrastructure was justification after the fact. The legal questions were genuinely difficult. Is infrastructure that moves both humanitarian goods and weapons a legitimate military target? Does the presence of civilian goods in a smuggling tunnel provide it with protected status under international humanitarian law? If a tunnel primarily moves food but occasionally moves weapons, how should it be categorized? Legal scholars disagreed, and practical policy reflected this uncertainty. The economic data told a brutal story. In 2012, when tunnel operations peaked, Gaza's formal unemployment rate was 23%, catastrophically high but sustainable. In 2015, after tunnel operations collapsed, unemployment reached 43%. Poverty rates followed similar trajectories, 38% in 2012, 53% in 2015. The correlation between tunnel activity and economic indicators was undeniable, but correlation wasn't causation in any simple sense. The 2014 war destroyed not just tunnels but homes, businesses, and infrastructure. Egyptian border closures affected trade beyond tunnels. Israeli restrictions on goods and movement intensified. Still, analysts studying Gaza's economy consistently identified tunnel collapse as a primary driver of post-2014 economic deterioration. Children bore the costs most visibly. Malnutrition rates increased as food prices rose. Educational outcomes declined as construction materials needed for school repairs became prohibitively expensive. Healthcare suffered as medicine prices spiked and fuel shortages forced hospitals to reduce services. These weren't theoretical humanitarian concerns. They were measurable declines in child welfare, directly correlated with tunnel infrastructure destruction. International donors tried to fill gaps, but their resources were constrained by donor fatigue, political restrictions on funding anything that might benefit Hamas, and the simple reality that official aid couldn't match the volume and efficiency that the tunnel economy had provided. UNRWA, the UN agency responsible for Palestinian refugees, repeatedly issued warnings about humanitarian crisis. But their appeals for increased funding met with limited response. The paradox remained unresolved by 2015. Gaza needed the tunnels to survive, but couldn't have security while they existed. The underground economy sustained families and funded fighters. Every ton of food that moved through tunnels made Hamas stronger and Gazans more dependent on infrastructure that guaranteed continued conflict. There were no good solutions, only impossible choices. The last generation of tunnels bore little resemblance to the first. Where early smugglers crawled through passages barely wide enough for shoulders, later operations moved through concrete reinforced chambers lit by LED systems and ventilated by industrial fans. The technological sophistication was remarkable, not because Gaza had access to advanced equipment, but because engineers improvised solutions from salvaged materials and learned from each generation's failures. By 2013, the most sophisticated tunnels in Gaza represented nearly 2 decades of accumulated engineering knowledge. The evolution was visible in every aspect of design: depth, width, reinforcement, ventilation, and transportation systems. Each generation learned from the previous one's collapses, floods, and detection by Israeli intelligence. Depth standards had converged on 15 to 18 meters, as optimal, deep enough to avoid most ground-penetrating radar, shallow enough to dig without industrial equipment. But the methods for reaching that depth had transformed. Early tunnels used simple vertical shafts with rope ladders. Later designs incorporated spiral staircases, sometimes concrete reinforced, that allowed workers to descend safely while carrying tools and materials. The most advanced operations built elevator systems, metal cages on cable pulley systems that could move workers and cargo vertically in minutes rather than the exhausting climb required by ladders. Structural reinforcement evolved from wooden beams to hybrid systems, combining wood, concrete, and metal. Engineers discovered that certain techniques from mining operations, arched ceilings that distributed load more effectively than flat ceilings, significantly reduced collapse risk. Some tunnels incorporated concrete spray systems, similar to those used in subway construction, that sealed earthen walls with a protective layer that prevented moisture infiltration and strengthened structural integrity. Ventilation represented perhaps the most dramatic technical advancement. Early tunnels relied on passive air circulation through shafts, often inadequate and sometimes fatal when carbon dioxide accumulated. By 2010, sophisticated tunnels featured multi-stage ventilation, intake fans at one end drawing fresh air in, exhaust fans at the other end pushing stale air out, with supplementary circulation fans every 20 meters along the tunnel length. Power came from generators on the Egyptian side, with electrical cables running the tunnel length to provide lighting and equipment power throughout. Transportation systems inside tunnels evolved to match the volume of goods being moved. The progression was logical. manual dragging, then sleds on rails, then electric rail systems, and finally, in a few premium tunnels, small diesel-powered vehicles capable of navigating the confined spaces. The most sophisticated transportation system, operational in a tunnel controlled by the Abu Shamale family, featured automated pulley carts controlled by operators on either end via radio communication, allowing cargo to move through the tunnel without anyone needing to accompany it. Lighting transformed from kerosene lamps and flashlights to comprehensive electrical systems. LED strips, which became available cheaply from Chinese manufacturers in the late 2000s, lined tunnel ceilings in some operations, providing consistent illumination that made work safer and faster. The psychological impact was significant. Workers reported that well-lit tunnels felt less claustrophobic and reduced the anxiety that came from working in near darkness. Communication systems were equally important. Early tunnel operations relied on shouting or runners to coordinate between the two ends. Later operations used wired telephone systems, then radio communications, and eventually mobile phones with signal boosters that allowed operators on the Gaza and Egyptian sides to coordinate in real time. Some tunnels even had internet connectivity, allowing operators to send detailed cargo manifests electronically rather than through paper documentation. Safety equipment, largely absent in the 1,990 seconds, became standard in professional operations by 2010. Tunnel workers wore hard hats, often salvaged construction helmets, spray-painted with worker identification. Respiratory masks, though not universal, were increasingly common. Some operations provided emergency oxygen canisters stationed at intervals along tunnel lengths, available if ventilation failed. Rope escape lines attached securely to tunnel walls gave workers something to follow in darkness if lighting systems failed. The most technically impressive tunnels featured modular design, chambers at intervals that could serve multiple purposes, rest areas for workers, storage for goods awaiting transport, reinforced sections designed to survive partial collapses elsewhere in the tunnel. This modular approach meant that if Israeli airstrikes damaged one section, other sections could continue operating, and repairs could focus on the damaged segment, rather than rebuilding the entire passage. But technical sophistication brought new vulnerabilities. More electrical systems meant more heat signatures detectable by Israeli thermal imaging. Better lighting required more power generation, creating electromagnetic signatures that intelligence agencies could monitor. The very features that made tunnels safer and more efficient also made them easier to detect by enemies investing millions in counter-tunnel technology. By 2014, Gaza's tunnels represented a strange hybrid. Third-world labor using first-world techniques improvised from salvaged materials, operating in conditions that violated every safety standard while achieving logistical results that would have impressed professional engineers. Then the bombardment came, and sophistication met explosives. Evolution had reached its end point. Some tunnels moved cigarettes, others moved construction materials. But a third category, never more than a few dozen at any time, served a different purpose entirely. These passages didn't end at the border, they extended under it, reaching into Israeli territory where Hamas fighters could emerge behind military positions, attacking from a direction enemies couldn't easily defend. The Israeli military called them terror tunnels. Hamas called them strategic assets. Both were right. The first confirmed cross-border attack tunnel was discovered by Israeli forces in 2006, though intelligence analysts suspected earlier incidents might have involved similar infrastructure. These tunnels differed fundamentally from smuggling passages. They didn't need to accommodate large cargo volumes or sustain continuous commercial traffic. They needed to hide completely until the moment of use, then deliver fighters into Israeli territory quickly and with maximum surprise. Construction of attack tunnels was exclusively controlled by Hamas's military wing, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades. Unlike commercial smuggling tunnels, which were syndicated among civilian investors, attack tunnels were military infrastructure funded directly by Hamas and built by specialized combat engineering units. Security was absolute. Even many Hamas political officials didn't know attack tunnel locations, and civilian tunnel workers weren't used for construction due to operational security concerns. The engineering requirements were more demanding than for smuggling tunnels. Attack tunnels extended farther, sometimes more than a kilometer from Gaza, into Israeli territory, with exit points located near Israeli military positions or civilian communities. They had to be deeper to avoid detection by Israeli sensors that monitored the border area intensively. Typical depth was 20 to 25 meters, significantly deeper than commercial tunnels, requiring more sophisticated excavation and reinforcement techniques. Speed of construction mattered less than secrecy. Commercial tunnels might be completed in 3 months with crews working continuously. Attack tunnels took a year or longer, with work conducted only during night hours when construction noise was less likely to be detected. Excavated sand had to be disposed of carefully, scattered across agricultural fields or mixed into construction projects, never simply dumped where satellite imagery might reveal suspicious activity. The first operational use of an attack tunnel came in June 2006, when Hamas fighters used an underground passage to attack an Israeli military outpost near Kerem Shalom, killing 2 soldiers and capturing Corporal Gilad Shalit. The audacity of the operation, emerging from underground directly inside an Israeli military position, sent shockwaves through Israeli defense establishment. If Hamas could tunnel under the border undetected, no military position near Gaza was truly secure. Israeli response was immediate, but initially ineffective. Military engineers tried to develop detection systems that could identify deep tunnels before they became operational. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic sensors, and even attempted training dogs to detect underground vibrations. None proved reliable enough to prevent subsequent tunnel construction. Hamas simply dug deeper, worked more slowly, and accepted longer construction timelines to maintain secrecy. The 2014 Gaza conflict brought attack tunnels to forefront of Israeli military planning. During the war, Hamas fighters emerged from multiple cross-border tunnels, attacking Israeli positions from unexpected directions. In one incident, 13 fighters emerged from a tunnel inside Israeli territory, engaging military forces in a firefight that killed several soldiers before the attackers were neutralized. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical damage. Israeli communities near Gaza lived with knowledge that enemy fighters could literally appear underground. The Israeli ground operation during the 2014 war prioritized attack tunnel destruction above almost all other objectives. Combat engineers systematically cleared border areas, using specialized detection equipment, explosive charges, and concrete demolitions to neutralize identified tunnels. By war's end, Israeli military claimed to have destroyed 32 cross-border attack tunnels, essentially eliminating Hamas's underground infiltration capability. But destroying existing tunnels didn't prevent new construction. Intelligence assessments after 2014 acknowledged that Hamas retained technical capability and institutional knowledge to rebuild attack tunnels, if allowed time and resources. The question was whether Israel could develop detection and destruction methods faster than Hamas could dig. The economic cost of attack tunnels, while important to Hamas, was secondary to strategic value. A single attack tunnel might cost $500,000 to $1 million to construct, expensive by Gaza standards but trivial compared to potential military impact. One successful infiltration operation killing Israeli soldiers or capturing prisoners provided propaganda victories and negotiating leverage worth far more than construction costs. The human cost, as always, fell on workers. Attack tunnel construction was even more dangerous than commercial tunneling due to greater depth, longer distances, and operational security requirements that prevented many safety measures. Hamas used trusted fighters and paid well, but accidents still occurred. Several combat engineers died in collapses during attack tunnel construction, though Hamas rarely acknowledged these casualties publicly. By 2015, the era of large-scale cross-border attack tunnels appeared to be ending, not because Hamas had abandoned the tactic, but because Israeli countermeasures had made them prohibitively difficult to construct and operate. The underground warfare had shifted again, and both sides were already planning the next evolution. While diplomats negotiated ceasefires and international media covered rocket exchanges, the tunnels operated in a strange blind spot. The infrastructure moving hundreds of millions in goods and weapons annually received only sporadic attention from the international community. The omission wasn't accidental. Acknowledging the tunnel economy meant confronting uncomfortable questions about blockade effectiveness, Hamas governance, and whether Gaza's siege was achieving anything beyond generating alternative smuggling routes. The United Nations knew about the tunnels. International NGOs knew about the tunnels. Foreign diplomats stationed in Israel and Egypt knew about the tunnels. Yet the tunnel economy rarely appeared in official reports, policy recommendations, or international diplomatic initiatives addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The silence was strategic. Discussing tunnels meant taking positions on issues most international actors preferred to avoid. Israel regularly briefed foreign diplomats on tunnel activity, using the intelligence as justification for blockade policies. The briefings included satellite imagery, captured tunnel equipment, and evidence of weapons smuggling. The message was consistent. Hamas uses tunnels for military purposes. Therefore, restrictive import policies are security necessities, not collective punishment. Many Western governments found this argument persuasive, or at least convenient, for explaining their own reluctance to pressure Israel on blockade policies. But the same governments avoided discussing the humanitarian aspects of tunnel operations. Acknowledging that 70% of Gaza's imports came through illegal tunnels raised uncomfortable questions about international community's failure to ensure civilian access to basic goods through legitimate channels. If tunnels were necessary to prevent humanitarian catastrophe, what did that say about the blockade's severity? If tunnels weren't necessary, why did they dominate Gaza's economy? The International Committee of the Red Cross, maintaining its traditional discretion, rarely commented publicly on tunnels despite extensive knowledge of their operations. ICRC officials visited Gaza regularly, documenting humanitarian conditions and engaging with both Israeli and Hamas authorities. They understood the tunnel economy's role in sustaining civilian populations, but maintained neutrality that precluded public statements that might appear to endorse illegal smuggling infrastructure. UNRWA, the UN agency responsible for Palestinian refugees, faced a more direct dilemma. The organization provided assistance to Gaza's population, but operated within frameworks that technically prohibited engagement with illegal economic activities. UNRWA officials knew the food they distributed competed with cheaper tunnel-smuggled Egyptian goods. They knew the schools they operated used tunnel-smuggled fuel to power generators. But acknowledging this officially would complicate relationships with donor governments funding UNRWA operations. The European Union's position was particularly contradictory. EU officials regularly criticized the Israeli blockade as excessive and harmful to Gaza's civilian population. Simultaneously, the EU listed Hamas as a terrorist organization and officially opposed any activities that supported Hamas governance. The tunnels clearly did both. They undermined the blockade while generating revenue for Hamas. EU policy papers resolved this contradiction by simply not discussing tunnels extensively, focusing instead on abstract calls for improving humanitarian access. Arab governments maintained similar ambiguity. Egypt publicly condemned smuggling while tolerating and profiting from the tunnel economy until 2013. Qatar and Turkey, Hamas's primary regional supporters, provided political backing and financial assistance, but carefully avoided direct discussion of how Gaza's economy actually functioned. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, hostile to Hamas but ostensibly concerned with Palestinian welfare, avoided engaging with the practical reality that tunnels were sustaining Gaza's population. Academic researchers and investigative journalists documented the tunnel economy in detail, producing studies and reports that circulated among policy communities. But this documentation rarely translated into policy changes. The tunnel economy existed in a space where everyone knew the facts, but found it politically convenient to focus on other aspects of the conflict. The International Criminal Court, investigating potential war crimes in Gaza, faced evidentiary complications around tunnel infrastructure. Were tunnels legitimate military targets? Did attacking them constitute disproportionate harm to civilians if it also destroyed economic lifelines? Different legal scholars reached different conclusions, and the ICC's investigation avoided definitive positions on tunnel-specific issues while examining broader questions about proportionality and civilian protection. Perhaps most remarkably, international development organizations working on Gaza reconstruction after successive conflicts generally avoided addressing how reconstruction materials would enter Gaza given blockade restrictions. The unspoken answer was often that materials would enter through tunnels or through smuggling networks that operated similarly. Development funding thus indirectly sustained the same illegal infrastructure donors officially opposed. By 2015, this international blind spot was becoming unsustainable. The collapse of tunnel operations hadn't been replaced by improved, legitimate access. Gaza's economy was simply deteriorating rather than adapting. International organizations began tentatively acknowledging that the previous situation, problematic as it was, had at least maintained some economic functionality. The current situation was arguably worse. The tunnels were mostly gone, the blockade remained, and no alternative system existed to meet civilian needs. The blind spot was lifting, but slowly, and the view it revealed was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Nobody counted the environmental cost, while cigarettes and cement flowed. The tunnels poisoned aquifers, contaminated soil, and accelerated Gaza's ecological collapse, a crisis that would outlast Hamas, outlast the blockade, outlast every political solution or military operation. The underground scars would remain for generations, invisible to satellites but deadly to anyone drawing water from wells that had been Gaza's lifeline for millennia. Gaza's aquifer had been in trouble long before tunnels. Decades of overpumping, inadequate sewage treatment, and agricultural runoff had turned one of the region's historic water sources into one of its most contaminated. UN studies in the early 2000s warned that the aquifer was approaching irreversible damage, with saltwater intrusion from the Mediterranean corrupting freshwater supplies and nitrate contamination making water dangerous to drink. The tunnels accelerated this crisis in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for years. Each tunnel represented a puncture through the aquifer's natural geological layers, clay and rock formations, that had historically prevented surface contaminants from reaching groundwater. These punctures created channels, allowing pollutants to flow directly into water-bearing strata that supplied Gaza's wells and municipal water systems. The contamination was multifaceted. Tunnel construction disturbed soil containing decades of accumulated pollutants, heavy metals, petroleum products, chemical residues from industrial activities. As tunnels flooded, whether from natural seepage or deliberate Israeli flooding operations, these contaminants dissolved into water that flowed directly into the aquifer. Hydrogeologists studying Gaza's water quality after 2010 found elevated levels of numerous harmful substances in wells near tunnel-dense areas, with contamination patterns suggesting tunnel-related sources. Seawater flooding, used by both Israeli and Egyptian forces to destroy tunnels, created particularly severe long-term damage. When Mediterranean seawater was pumped into tunnel networks, much of it didn't stay in the tunnels. It percolated through fractured geological layers, mixing with freshwater in the aquifer and increasing salinity. Desalination of brackish groundwater is technically possible, but prohibitively expensive for an impoverished territory. Once salinity reaches certain thresholds, water becomes unusable for agriculture or human consumption without treatment Gaza couldn't afford. The scope was difficult to measure because tunnel locations were often secret, and neither Hamas nor Israel wanted to document environmental damage that might complicate their respective narratives. But fragmentary evidence painted a concerning picture. Agricultural areas near Rafah reported increasing soil salinity, making farming increasingly difficult. Wells that had provided acceptable water quality for decades suddenly showed elevated nitrate levels dangerous to infants. Some neighborhoods experienced complete well failures as aquifer structure collapsed into tunnel voids. Fuel smuggling created its own environmental disaster. Substandard Egyptian diesel, smuggled through tunnels in massive volumes, inevitably spilled during transport and storage. Soil samples from areas near fuel tunnels showed petroleum contamination at levels that would trigger mandatory remediation in any country with functioning environmental regulation. Gaza had no such capability. The contamination simply remained, leaching into groundwater and poisoning soil that families used for gardens and children played in. The diesel generators that burned smuggled fuel created air quality problems throughout Gaza. These generators, often old and poorly maintained, ran on fuel that didn't meet modern emission standards. The result was pervasive air pollution, particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, sulfur compounds at levels that WHO studies linked to increased respiratory disease, particularly among children and elderly populations. Tunnel collapses created subsidence problems in urban areas, as underground voids collapsed, whether from natural causes, deliberate flooding, or military strikes. The surface above sometimes sank. Buildings developed cracks, roads buckled, and water pipes ruptured. The repairs were rarely made properly due to resource limitations, creating cascade effects where initial subsidence led to infrastructure failure that caused additional problems. Perhaps most concerning was the irreversibility. Environmental engineers assessing Gaza's situation noted that aquifer contamination, once established, persists for decades even if contamination sources are eliminated. Saltwater intrusion is extremely difficult to reverse, requiring years of reduced pumping and managed aquifer recharge, with clean water, neither of which was feasible in Gaza's circumstances. The soil contamination from fuel spills and industrial pollutants would remain unless expensive remediation was undertaken. The human health impacts were already visible by 2015. Gaza's hospitals treated increasing numbers of patients with waterborne diseases linked to contaminated water supplies. Respiratory illnesses attributed to air pollution were rising. Children showed elevated blood lead levels in areas near tunnel operations, suggesting exposure to contaminated soil and water. International environmental organizations raised alarms, but the issue received minimal attention compared to the immediate humanitarian crises of warfare and blockade. Environmental degradation was a slow catastrophe, less visually dramatic than bombardment, but potentially more lasting in its impacts. By 2015, even as tunnel operations declined, the environmental legacy was permanent. Gaza's aquifer, already stressed, had been dealt a blow that no future peace agreement or economic development could quickly reverse. The tunnels had provided short-term economic survival at the cost of long-term ecological sustainability, a trade-off nobody had explicitly chosen but everyone would pay for. Brotherhood turned a crackdown in 18 months. When Mohammed Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood government fell to military coup in July 2013, Hamas lost more than a political ally. It lost the lifeline that had sustained Gaza's economy. President Sisi's government viewed Hamas as an extension of the Brotherhood, a threat to Egyptian national security operating from next door. The response would be systematic, brutal, and ultimately more effective than any Israeli military operation at destroying the Tunnel Empire. The Muslim Brotherhood's brief tenure in power following Egypt's 2011 revolution had been a golden age for Hamas. President Morsi, ideologically aligned with Hamas as a fellow Brotherhood organization, relaxed restrictions on Gaza border crossings and quietly tolerated increased tunnel activity. Egyptian security officials who had long cooperated with tunnel operations through bribery now did so with tacit political approval from higher authorities. Hamas leaders made strategic miscalculations during this period. Rather than maintaining low profiles and preserving the relationship, some Hamas officials publicly celebrated Egyptian Brotherhood's rise and made provocative statements about Islamic governance spreading throughout the region. When Egyptian military tensions with the Brotherhood escalated in 2013, Hamas's public identification with Morsi's government made them targets by association. The military coup that ousted Morsi on the 3rd of July 2013 immediately threatened Hamas's position. General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who led the coup and would become president, viewed the Muslim Brotherhood as Egypt's primary security threat. His government designated the Brotherhood a terrorist organization, arrested thousands of members, and began systematic campaigns to eliminate Brotherhood influence from Egyptian society. Hamas, as the Brotherhood's Palestinian branch, was inevitably included in this purge. The border crackdown began within weeks of the coup. Egyptian security forces received orders to shut down tunnel operations permanently. The approach was comprehensive: demolish the Rafah buffer zone on the Egyptian side, destroying any structures that might conceal tunnel entrances, flood detected tunnels with seawater, arrest smugglers and tunnel operators, and rotate security personnel to prevent the corruption relationships that had sustained operations. The buffer zone demolition was particularly devastating. Egyptian forces gave residents minimal notice before bulldozers arrived, sometimes 48 hours, sometimes less. Approximately 1,200 homes were demolished between 2013 and 2015, displacing over 10,000 Egyptian citizens, most of them Bedouin families who had lived in Rafah for generations. Human rights organizations documented the destruction, but Egyptian authorities were unmoved. The security imperative eliminating tunnels took absolute precedence over civilian concerns. Egyptian security forces also intensified operations against smugglers on the Sinai side. Military intelligence identified key figures in the smuggling network's families like the Abu Rayyans, who had operated for decades, and targeted them for arrest. Dozens of smugglers were detained, often held without formal charges, and pressured to provide intelligence on tunnel locations and Hamas contacts. The message was clear. The previous system of bribery and tolerance was permanently ended. The flooding operations were systematic. Egyptian military engineers identified hundreds of tunnel entrances and began pumping seawater from the Mediterranean directly into underground passages. The volume was enormous, reportedly millions of gallons pumped over several months. Tunnels flooded, collapsed, and became permanently unusable. The seawater also infiltrated Gaza's aquifer on the Palestinian side, causing environmental damage that would persist for decades. Hamas's response was initially defiant. Organization leaders condemned Egyptian actions, accused Sisi's government of betraying Palestinian resistance, and attempted to rally international support against the crackdown. But Hamas had limited leverage. Egypt was a sovereign nation securing its border, and the international community showed little appetite for criticizing Cairo's counter-tunnel operations, especially given that Israel had been conducting similar operations for years. The economic impact on Gaza was catastrophic, as Egyptian enforcement intensified through 2013 and 2014. Tunnel capacity collapsed. Fuel prices in Gaza spiked from 12 shekels per liter to 25. Construction materials became unaffordable. Basic consumer goods that had been readily available through smuggling suddenly disappeared from markets or sold at prices most families couldn't afford. Hamas's revenue from tunnel operations, which had funded civil service salaries and social programs, plummeted. The organization faced a fiscal crisis unprecedented since taking power. Civil servants went months without salaries. Hamas-run schools and hospitals struggled to maintain operations. The social services that had sustained Hamas's popularity among ordinary Gazans deteriorated rapidly. By early 2015, intelligence estimates suggested operational tunnel capacity had decreased approximately 80% from 2012 peaks. The remaining tunnels, operated with much greater risk, required extensive security measures, and moved far smaller volumes. The billion-dollar empire had been dismantled not by Israeli military power, but by Egyptian political decision that Hamas had no ability to counter. The betrayal from Hamas's perspective was complete. The same Egyptian border that had once provided economic lifeline was now sealed more effectively than ever before. And unlike Israeli actions, which Hamas could frame as aggression from an enemy state, Egyptian actions came from fellow Arabs, fellow Muslims, and theoretically fellow travelers in resistance to Israeli domination. The ideological and strategic implications would shape Hamas decision-making for years to come. When the tunnels closed, the theory was that legitimate trade would replace smuggling, that international pressure would force blockade easing, that Gaza's economy would normalize. None of this happened. Instead, Gaza entered an economic twilight, the tunnel infrastructure mostly destroyed, the blockade largely maintained, and 2 million people trapped in a territory with no functioning economic foundation. The question wasn't how to recover prosperity, it was how to survive without it. By mid-2015, Gaza's economy had contracted approximately 40% from its 2012 peak, measured by any standard metric: GDP, employment, import volumes, or household income. The contraction exceeded the economic damage caused by the 2008 to 2009 and 2014 military conflicts combined. Warfare destroyed physical infrastructure that could be rebuilt. The tunnel economy's collapse destroyed the invisible infrastructure supply networks, employment systems, revenue streams that had sustained Gaza under siege. Unemployment told the starkest story. The official rate reached 43% in 2015, highest in the world for a territory not experiencing active warfare. Youth unemployment exceeded 60%. For the generation entering the workforce between 2010 and 2015, legitimate employment opportunities barely existed. The tunnel economy had provided work, dangerous, grueling work, but work nonetheless for thousands of young men. That option was gone, replaced by nothing except international aid programs that provided subsistence but not livelihoods. The merchant class adapted by shifting to Israeli-approved imports, but at massive cost disadvantages. Where tunnels smuggled cement had cost 60 shekels per bag, Israeli-approved cement cost 120. Egyptian fuel at tunnel prices had been 8 shekels per liter. Israeli fuel was 18. These price increases rippled through the entire economy. Construction became prohibitively expensive, delaying reconstruction from war damage and preventing new development. Transportation costs doubled, affecting everything from vegetable prices to school attendance. Families that had achieved modest middle-class status during the tunnel era found themselves impoverished. Hamas faced a fiscal crisis that threatened its governing capacity. Tunnel taxation had provided approximately $70 million annually at peak. By 2015, that figure had dropped below $15 million. The organization had to make brutal choices: stop paying civil service salaries, cut social programs, or find alternative revenue. Hamas chose all three, partially. Civil servants received sporadic partial payments. Social services continued, but at reduced levels. And Hamas began aggressively taxing the remaining formal economy, imposing fees and levies that drove further businesses into bankruptcy. International aid organizations attempted to fill gaps, but their resources were inadequate to the scale of need. UN agencies in Gaza reported that they were essentially maintaining a permanent humanitarian emergency, providing food assistance to over half the population, while knowing this was sustainable neither fiscally nor socially. Donor governments experiencing their own fiscal pressures showed decreasing willingness to fund Gaza aid programs indefinitely, particularly when Hamas governance complicated any narrative about supporting Palestinian aspirations. The informal economy that emerged post-tunnels was grimmer than what preceded it. Where tunnel operations had been sophisticated smuggling enterprises, the new informal economy was survival trading. Families selling possessions to buy food, micro-businesses operating at subsistence margins, and barter systems replacing cash transactions as liquidity disappeared from the economy. This wasn't an economy in any conventional sense. It was improvised survival mechanisms that prevented starvation but couldn't support population growth or development. Agricultural production, one sector that theoretically could have expanded to replace lost imports, instead contracted. Farmers couldn't afford input seeds, fertilizer, fuel for irrigation pumps at post-tunnel prices. Israeli military restrictions on Gaza's agricultural lands, particularly areas near the border, made farming dangerous. The environmental damage from tunnel operations and flooding had degraded soil quality in agricultural areas. Farm output declined approximately 30% between 2012 and 2015, precisely when increased self-sufficiency was most needed. Manufacturing virtually ceased. Gaza's small industrial sector had depended on imported raw materials that arrived cheaply through tunnels. Post-2015, import costs made manufacturing uncompetitive with finished goods that still arrived through official channels. Factories closed, throwing thousands more into unemployment. The industrial zone near Karni Crossing, once employing over 5,000 workers, was essentially abandoned by 2015. A peculiar form of economic paralysis set in. Nobody wanted to invest in businesses that depended on imported materials at Israeli-approved prices. Nobody wanted to hire workers when consumer demand was collapsing. Families didn't want to spend savings when employment prospects were dire. The result was an economy frozen in contraction, where every rational individual decision to protect personal resources contributed to collective economic decline. International economists studying Gaza's situation noted disturbing parallels to failed states and prolonged siege economies from history. The combination of isolation, restricted trade, and governance by an internationally isolated organization created conditions that economic theory predicted would lead to complete collapse. That Gaza hadn't collapsed entirely was attributed more to international humanitarian assistance and population resilience than to any sustainable economic foundation. By late 2015, the grim reality was apparent. The tunnel economy hadn't been replaced by anything better. It had simply ended, leaving Gaza demonstrably worse off. Every intelligence failure prompts lessons learned studies. Every military operation generates after-action reports. But the tunnel economy's rise and fall revealed something more troubling than tactical mistakes or intelligence gaps. It showed how blockade policies created the conditions they were meant to prevent, how military solutions generated adaptive responses that were more dangerous than original problems, and how international communities' passivity enabled a 2-decade cycle that left everyone worse off. The Israeli security establishment conducted extensive analysis of the tunnel phenomenon after the 2014 war. The classified studies, portions of which later leaked to Israeli media, reached uncomfortable conclusions. Military pressure had proven inadequate to prevent tunnel construction. Intelligence, despite significant resources invested in detection capabilities, consistently underestimated tunnel proliferation rates. Ground operations could destroy tunnels temporarily, but couldn't prevent reconstruction. The only permanently effective countermeasure had been Egyptian political changes that Israel couldn't control or replicate. Some Israeli analysts drew a more provocative conclusion. The blockade itself had incentivized tunnel construction by creating profitable black markets and making Hamas dependent on smuggling revenue. Had Gaza been allowed normal commercial activity through legitimate border crossings, the economic incentive for tunnels would have been minimal. Hamas might still have attempted weapons smuggling, but without the cover provided by massive commercial tunnel operations, such military tunnels would have been far easier to detect and destroy. This analysis had policy implications that Israeli leaders found politically unacceptable. Easing the blockade to reduce tunnel incentives meant strengthening Hamas economically and potentially enabling weapons accumulation through legitimate channels. The alternative, maintaining restrictions while accepting periodic tunnel reconstruction, meant permanent instability and regular military operations. Neither option was strategically appealing, so policy largely continued unchanged. Maintain the blockade, conduct tunnel destruction operations when necessary, and hope that eventually cumulative pressure would force Hamas concessions. Hamas conducted its own lessons learned analysis, though this was less documented and more difficult to verify. Intelligence intercepts and defector accounts suggested that Hamas leadership recognized several strategic errors. The organization had become overly dependent on a single economic model that was vulnerable to external disruption. Hamas had assumed Egyptian cooperation would continue indefinitely, neglecting to build redundancy into their revenue systems. The organization had failed to adequately diversify its economic base before the 2013 Egyptian coup destroyed their primary income source. Some Hamas leaders reportedly argued for shifting toward a more conventional governance model, reduced military spending, accommodation with international donor requirements, and accepting some cooperation with Palestinian Authority to restore legitimate trade access. This faction was overruled by hardliners who maintained that resistance to Israel was non-negotiable, and that economic hardship, while painful, was preferable to political compromise. This internal debate would continue shaping Hamas' strategy for years. The Palestinian Authority, governing the West Bank while excluded from Gaza, drew its own lessons. Never allow armed groups to establish independent revenue sources that undermine central authority. PA security services had lost Gaza, partly because Hamas had developed economic independence through smuggling. PA officials were determined not to repeat that mistake, maintaining strict control over West Bank economic activity, even when it created inefficiencies and corruption opportunities. The international community's lesson learning was perhaps most deficient. UN agencies and international NGOs documented the humanitarian costs of the blockade tunnel cycle extensively. Reports described how siege created smuggling, how smuggling funded militancy, how militancy justified siege, creating perpetual crisis. But these reports rarely translated into policy changes. Western governments continued supporting the blockade framework while funding humanitarian assistance to mitigate its worst impacts, a contradiction that satisfied neither humanitarian nor security objectives. Egypt's lesson from the experience was straightforward. Hamas is a security threat requiring absolute border closure, regardless of humanitarian consequences. The Sisi government showed no inclination toward the nuanced balance between security and economic activity that had characterized previous Egyptian approaches. The border would remain largely sealed, tunnels would be destroyed systematically, and Gaza's economic distress was Hamas's problem to manage. Academic researchers studying the Gaza tunnel economy produced sophisticated analyses of blockade effectiveness, smuggling economics, and insurgent finance. Their work appeared in scholarly journals and policy papers that circulated among think tanks and universities. The research demonstrated convincingly that the existing approach was counterproductive, creating economic incentives for exactly the behaviors Israel was trying to prevent. This scholarship was intellectually impressive, but politically irrelevant policymakers on all sides had domestic political constraints that prevented adoption of recommendations that scholars found obvious. Perhaps the most important unlearned lesson was about adaptation. Siege warfare has a millennium of historical precedent, showing that besieged populations develop remarkable adaptive capacity. The Gaza tunnels were merely one example. Leningrad, during World War II, developed ice roads across frozen lakes. Sarajevo built tunnels during the Bosnian War. West Berlin developed airlift logistics during the Soviet blockade. Assuming that blockade pressure would eventually force political concessions ignored this consistent historical pattern. Sieges cause adaptation before they cause capitulation. By 2015, as analysts reviewed 2 decades of tunnel economics, the fundamental question remained unanswered. What would actually change the strategic calculus? And nobody had convincing answers. The tunnels are mostly gone now, but the siege remains. The billion-dollar empire collapsed, but the conditions that created it persist. 2 million people still live trapped between walls, sea, and politics that have calcified into permanent stalemate. The underground economy was never the problem. It was a symptom of a system designed to pressure Hamas that instead punished civilians while funding exactly what it meant to prevent. The lesson is simple. Nobody learned it. Gaza, in late 2015, existed in an economic twilight that previous generations would have considered impossible. 2 million people living in an area smaller than many cities, denied access to normal trade, employment, or movement, sustained primarily through international humanitarian assistance that was explicitly designed to be temporary. The tunnel economy had masked this unsustainability for nearly a decade. Its absence revealed the truth. Gaza, under current conditions, had no economic viability. The numbers told a story of systematic underdevelopment, unemployment above 40%, poverty above 50%, and youth unemployment exceeding 60%. More than 2/3 of the population received some form of humanitarian assistance. The economy had contracted to approximately 30% below its size before Hamas took power in 2007. Infrastructure, water systems, power generation, sewage treatment was collapsing from deferred maintenance that nobody could afford to address. The human costs accumulated in ways that statistics struggled to capture. University graduates who had never held jobs, children growing up in households where no adult worked, families that had been middle class in 2010 dependent on food aid in 2015. The psychological toll of permanent economic siege was documented by mental health professionals operating in Gaza. Rising depression, anxiety, domestic violence, and hopelessness among a population with no clear path toward better futures. But the blockade continued because the political logic that justified it remained unchanged. Israel insisted that easing restrictions would allow Hamas to rearm and strengthen militarily. Hamas insisted that resistance to Israeli occupation was legitimate and non-negotiable. The Palestinian Authority wanted to undermine Hamas by ensuring its governance failed. Egypt wanted to isolate what it viewed as a Muslim Brotherhood terrorist organization. International actors lacked leverage or will to force changes that any party actively opposed. The tunnel economy's collapse had actually reduced international pressure for policy change. When tunnels were operational, their existence proved that siege was ineffective and possibly counterproductive. Now that tunnels were mostly destroyed, the blockade appeared more successful. Hamas was economically weakened, weapons smuggling significantly reduced, and cross-border attack capability degraded. That these successes came at enormous humanitarian cost was acknowledged but treated as unfortunate but necessary consequences of security imperatives. Some analysts argued that permanent siege had become the actual policy, rather than a temporary measure meant to achieve political concessions. Israel had concluded that Hamas wouldn't be pressured into moderation, so the realistic goal was containment, keep Hamas weak enough that major conflicts occurred only every few years rather than constantly. Egypt shared this containment logic. The international community funded humanitarian assistance to prevent complete collapse while avoiding confrontation with Israel over fundamental policy. If this analysis was correct, and evidence suggested it was then, Gaza's economic future was essentially indefinite humanitarian crisis management. The territory would remain dependent on external aid, unable to develop self-sustaining economic activity, with living standards gradually declining as population growth outpaced whatever economic activity could occur under restrictions. Eventually, either the population would collapse into complete humanitarian catastrophe, forcing international intervention, or some external political change would shift the strategic calculations that maintained current policies. The tunnel builders, diggers, and operators who had sustained the underground empire mostly disappeared into the same unemployment that affected everyone else. Some former tunnel workers found occasional day labor. Others subsisted on family support or humanitarian assistance. A few were killed in subsequent conflicts. Many developed long-term health problems from years of underground work, respiratory conditions, back injuries, psychological trauma that they couldn't afford to treat in Gaza's overwhelmed healthcare system. The environmental damage from tunnels and flooding operations would persist for decades. Aquifer contamination was already affecting water quality throughout Gaza, forcing families to purchase expensive bottled water or risk health problems from polluted wells. Soil degradation in agricultural areas would take years of remediation that nobody was funding. The long-term public health costs were calculable but ignored future problems that current policymakers didn't have to address. By the end of 2015, the tunnel economy existed primarily as memory. Older Gazans remembered when Egyptian cigarettes flooded markets, when construction materials cost half current prices, when employment was available for anyone willing to dig. Younger Gazans, entering workforce in the post-tunnel economy, knew only unemployment and restriction. The past prosperity, such as it was, became mythologized, the present suffering normalized, and the future impossible to imagine improving without changes that nobody with power seemed willing to make. The tunnel economy represented a peculiar achievement. 2 decades of sophisticated infrastructure built by people the world viewed as isolated, impoverished, and desperate. The engineering was remarkable, the logistics impressive, the economic scale substantial enough to sustain governance and resistance simultaneously. But it was also fundamentally unsustainable, dependent on Egyptian cooperation that proved temporary, vulnerable to military operations that eventually degraded capability below recovery thresholds, and environmentally destructive in ways that would burden future generations. The billion-dollar empire is gone. The conditions that created it remain. Another generation will find another way to survive. The question is whether anyone with power to change the underlying dynamics will choose to do so before the next improvised solution creates the next 2 decades of conflict, suffering, and missed opportunities for something better. The tunnel story is finished, but the larger investigation continues. This series examined how siege creates adaptation, how desperation breeds ingenuity, and how short-term solutions become long-term disasters. If you want to understand how economic warfare shapes modern conflicts, how civilian populations survive impossible circumstances, or how policies often achieve the opposite of their stated goals, subscribe and join this investigation into power, survival, and the uncomfortable truths that policymakers prefer to ignore. The next chapter examines similar dynamics in different conflicts. The patterns repeat, the lessons remain unlearned, until they aren't. This investigation into Gaza's tunnel economy used declassified intelligence, first-hand accounts, economic data, and environmental studies to reconstruct a system that operated largely in secrecy. The human cost: diggers who died, families displaced, aquifers contaminated, deserve remembering beyond their utility as geopolitical talking points. The tactical innovations from simple cigarette smuggling to sophisticated cross-border attack infrastructure demonstrate adaptation that military planners still struggle to counter. And the fundamental paradox that Blockade, designed to weaken Hamas, instead funded it for nearly a decade, offers lessons about unintended consequences that extend far beyond Gaza. War isn't just bombs and soldiers. It's economics, engineering, and environmental degradation. It's ordinary people making impossible choices. The tunnels are gone. The people remain. Their next adaptations are already being planned in the same desperation that birthed the underground empire. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay skeptical. The truth is usually buried deeper than we're told to look.